but the purpose of tonight is to really think about how COVID is altering the way we see the world and maybe some of the opportunities that there are associated with that. So, sorry, I just clicked on the wrong thing there. So what we want to do is consider basically over the last decade, Orkney has been through an unprecedented sequence of twists and turns related to energy. And these have had a profound influence upon the islands and upon our capacity to adapt and combat climate change. And the pressures associated with that change were growing considerably. If you think back to November, December, the idea of the climate emergency was really gaining pace and momentum. But what happened is this COVID crisis has given us a kind of totally unforeseen change in momentum in the way the world is governed. And in particular, what it's done is led to governments acting in ways that they've never done before. They've done things that were frankly unthinkable. And what that has meant is that they've put the economy and some of their other priorities on hold and in second place compared to the health priority. And what that has shown is that we as a world, we as citizens, we as countries can do things that were not thought possible. And as we've lived through those 2 or 3 months of those unprecedented changes, people have started to think, well, what do we do when we come out of the other end? Where do we go to when we come out of COVID? Is it back to the old normal or the new normal? And what I wanted to do was to think about how we could influence the new normal, because there seems to be a growing momentum to say we have to go forward. And in Orkney, we have a particular role to play here, because effectively for the last 20 years, we've been thinking about what new world, new Orkney, new energy looks like. And so what we need to do, I would say, is look at what we've learned over the last decade and use that vision and leadership to help better influence the outcomes that are going to arise from the new normal on the basis of COVID. So the way that I was going to do that was to have a look, first of all, at what's just happened. I'm going to take 15 minutes to have a look at some of the statistics and the trends that are associated with that. And then maybe think about what is it that that experience has told us we want to leave behind, and what is it that we want to embrace and take forward. And this is going to be the first of the opportunities for you to use this wonderful new application called Polly, which, if we have any problems, Stuart's going to guide us through. And that should allow us to see interactively what you're thinking and what other people are thinking. I then wanted to go on to think about how us as people, how our behaviours have been adapted and what we've adopted in light of that COVID experience. And again, have a time for reflection. Around 8:10, we'll have a short break. And then coming back, we'll have a look at islands and how islands in particular can cope and flourish in this new normal situation, and what our energy system might look like in the future. And then to wrap up with, we're going to look first of all at your specific needs that you may have for this new energy system, and then look at how best we can achieve that transition. And if we've timetabled that right, then we'll finish on the dot at 9 o'clock or a little bit in advance. So the decade that we've just lived through. Basically, it started off with the UK introducing a feed-in tariff. And that led Orkney to put an awful lot of micro turbines up to exploit that tariff. It also led to the adoption of solar. And there was a tremendous burgeoning and growth in the participation in energy generation. There were other issues at the same time around austerity. We also, within a couple of years, had Scottish and Southern Energy imposing a grid connection moratorium. And then that was closely followed by a couple of years which were dominated by the Scottish independence referendum and the fallout from that in terms of the Smith Commission and Our Islands, Our Future. At the same time, there was technological advance going on in tide, in hydrogen, with EVs. And then latterly, we've been in a period, perhaps again, where the major political activities have dominated. Things like the Brexit referendum, the acknowledgement of the climate emergency and the COVID crisis. And alongside that, within Orkney, we've had initiatives such as the needs case that's been put forward by SSE to Ofgem to try and get a new cable across the Firth. And we've had planning applications for various kinds of development, and also the Reflex project has been initiated. So it's been a decade of incredible activity, a high degree of adaptation to changing circumstances and priorities, and a decade of great learning and experience, which we can now apply to the new situation. And this was a slide that was actually prepared as part of the Reflex project back in the autumn. So this was all before COVID. And basically what it was saying is that our current energy systems are failing us. For many reasons, they're looking back, not forward. They're full of carbon and leading to the climate change, which is our greatest threat and still, of course, our greatest threat. Economically, they're not really working for the whole of society. They're not responsive to the priorities that we have. And the regulations and the strategic planning associated with them are not really fit for purpose. And so to change all that, we believed that we need to change fundamentally what we're doing. We have to change the status quo. That is not an option. And to pick up Greta Thunberg's comment, our house is burning, these are some of the things we need to think. We need to believe in the unbelievable, imagine the unimaginable, think the unthinkable. Now, back in November and December, somebody... Okay, thank you. So back in November, December, maybe these in some ways seem hollow mantras about how much transformational change we need to consider. But I think what's come to pass is that COVID has shown that we can actually do a lot of these things we didn't believe were possible last year. So COVID and climate change, how are these two linked? So in a way, COVID has given us the chance to have the largest climate experiment that the world has ever had. The level of change that's taken place in travel, in transport, in industry, in the way in which we behave as people has never happened on this scale before. And so we can start to see for the first time, if we did something, what its actual impact would be on the emissions that arise from that activity. And the other thing that's been associated with this is us as global citizens have been asked to behave in ways that are so radical that we just would not have conceived that being possible. Back in November, December, if somebody said, you know, you're going to be sitting in your house for 2 or 3 months, people would have just laughed and said, look, it's not going to happen. But of course it has happened. And one of the other things that's happened is that governments who for decades have said there is no magic money tree have, of course, gone and found this magic money tree and literally shaken trillions of pounds, dollars, yen and euros off that tree to fund the interventions that are taking place at the moment to protect the economies and look after the functioning of the national economies in the world. And the reason they've done that is that there's this threat of mortality, the threat of death. And this graph or set of graphs shows a set of metrics which really show the level of mortality that there is in the world due to different causes. And you can see at the top there, malnutrition is the biggest cause of death in the world, with around 35 million deaths a year. And then you can see them reducing there, heart disease, cancers, etc. The arrow in the middle, which goes from 1 to 40, is the range of mortality that's expected to occur from COVID. And at the moment, as of today, the total is running at about 380,000. And on that scale of other activities, you can see there I've circled homicides, which is at the moment analogous to where COVID is on that scale of other activities. So it was really that threat of, and the other point to make is that that figure of where we are today is at that relatively low level because of all of the mitigation that's been put in place. If we hadn't had the mitigation, then the expectation would have been around 40 million deaths in the world, which would have put it up, obviously, alongside malnutrition. So clearly, we've been, to date, very successful as a world at limiting the mortality associated with COVID. But that's come at a cost in terms of the economy and our freedom as citizens to do what we would normally do. So the context here is, what can we learn from this situation where we've had drastic changes in the way that our lives are managed and what we're allowed to do to respond to a threat, which through the management of that has led it to be probably relatively modest in the scale of threats that exist in the world, but it had that potential to escalate to a much higher level. So looking at some of the data associated with what's happened, there's some interesting lessons. The first of these looking at, for example, locational differences in responses. So COVID occurred at different places at different times, and you can see here each of these graphs is adjusted to the same baseline. So you can see that Hong Kong, for example, had a very early spike in activity, whereas cities such as London and Rome and New York were much later. And what these graphs show are the levels of mobility as an indication of change. So the baseline there is the normal level of mobility, and then you can see the changes in mobility in these city locations. And what you can see is that the patterns are quite different. So some cities have had a collapse in mobility, others have had a longer tail. Places like Singapore have had much less impact than, say, cities like London and Rome. Another thing that data can show us, and this is all from mobile phone data, is about where we've traveled to. And this isn't now just thinking about cities, so this is in different countries and looking at our association with shops or with and different types of shops, with parks, with transit stations, travel transit stations, with the workplace and residential. And what this shows is that our patterns of movement between these different geographical places has changed drastically, with basically us being much more associated with residential locations and much less associated with workplace locations. And you can perhaps see the most drastic change there in terms of transit stations, because mobility has really been reduced. But what's also interesting is that those changes have altered and been different in different countries, reflecting the different dynamics, the natures of the economy, and the structures of the relationship between home and business and retail activities. So not only have we seen changing temporal patterns, but there's changing spatial patterns as well. And those patterns haven't just, of course, been on the ground, they've also been in the air. And one of the changes that we've heard about day in, day out is about the collapse in flight travel. And this graph shows over the last 4 years a typical pattern in flights during the year, with a peak in August and September, that very sharp drop around the Christmas, New Year time. And on the end here, you can see the blue line plunging down to under 80,000 flights. And that's, you know, less than half of what would normally be expected at this time of year. So that's the scale of the change that's happened in terms of aircraft travel. So what does that mean in terms of climate? What does that mean in terms of CO2 emissions? And this graph shows over the last 100 or so years the increase in CO2 emissions, and the red dot there is showing the projection of where we think the 2020 level might get to. Now, what's quite surprising to me is actually it only comes down that little bit. It's only about 5 billion tons, or about 15% of a reduction that's anticipated in CO2 emissions from this whole COVID event. And there's other predictions which suggest it might even be lower at 8%. So the message here is that it is a noticeable drop, but it's not totally transformational. And what becomes transformational is what we do with this experience that we're gaining at the present time. And this can be seen on this next graph, where this shows some of the projections that have been predicted for future trends in CO2 emissions depending on certain circumstances. And you can see there that if we're going to get to net zero, which is the black line, by 2050, which is our UK government target, 2045 is the Scottish government target, it shows the shape that we have to achieve overall in global terms. And you can see that that change from the blue line to the yellow dot is a relatively small change, but we have to absolutely understand what's happened in the last 2 or 3 months and then build on that to get down on that lowering curve. And another way of looking at that, zooming in more, this is now looking at the last 3 years and looking at the seasonal patterns that take place in CO2 emissions. And that light grey line there is the pulse of carbon concentrations now. So this is moving from emissions to atmospheric concentrations. And you can see that last year in 2019, we got to 415 parts per million. And the projection for this year was that we were going to get to about 418 parts per billion. And it may be that the effect of COVID is to reduce that by a small amount. But that small amount is only 0.4 of a part per million, which again, it actually astounded me that it's only going to make that much difference in the concentration. But that difference is less rather than more, and therefore we need to think about how, why is it so small? Can we make it bigger in the future? What changes would we have to make in our energy systems and in our lives to mean that that becomes a sustainable reduction that then can lead to that long-term goal of getting to net zero by 2050, 2045. So I think those figures begin to show that despite the huge shock that we've been through, the impact on global CO2 concentrations is so far relatively minor. So there are clearly links between COVID and climate change, but the point here is that COVID wasn't invented to create a benefit for climate change. So although the effects have been drastic on our lives, they've not necessarily been drastic on the way that we use energy, and we need to think about that. But there are clearly things that have happened where there's a link between health and energy. So transportation is an important source of emissions and an important user of energy, and there has been a reduction in transport. In terms of buildings, because we've stayed at home rather than going into the office, it doesn't mean that we've actually used less energy. We've just changed where that energy is used. So we probably ended up flattening our use at homes and reducing some of the peaks in buildings. We've also had a reduction in the use of energy in public facilities. And what we've also seen is that reduction in energy demand has lowered oil prices to critically low levels. That obviously has an impact on emissions as well by lowering oil demand. And what we've also seen is that the underlying health of the nations around the world is changing because people are starting to do more cycling, more walking, more home working, less flying. And all of these have knock-on effects on health and energy and sustainability. And you can see on the right-hand side there some of the little couplets that exist between energy and health issues. So a key question is then, what is the new world order going to look like? What is it that we want to leave behind? And what is it that we want to encourage and embrace? And I've just outlined here some words that reflect some of the things that might be considered part of yesterday's world and what might be considered part of the world for tomorrow. And what I thought at this point it would be interesting to do is to see what your thoughts were, having lived through this COVID crisis and hopefully having an interest in energy. Think about what are the things that we might want to leave behind as a world, and what are the things that we might want to embrace. And so this is the first of Stuart's poly questions, which is looking at things for society to leave behind. And I think if I stop talking at that point, Stuart will hopefully be able to bring up the questions.
Yeah, hi folks. This is the first time we've used this in external setting, so hopefully what you should see if you interact with your show conversation function is an interactive bit of text to enter a response to question 1, which is what should society leave behind? Hopefully you should all be able to interact with that. I did see somewhere that it might not work for external guests, but we'll just have to kind of see how it goes. So please, I think we've allotted, is it 5 minutes, Gareth? Is that right?
Yeah, yeah.
For responses to be submitted via here.
So what I was wanting people to think about here is, what are the things that you think, actually, we don't need to do that anymore. We can be better than this.
And just to reiterate a couple of housekeeping points, you can only submit one response to each question. If you submit one response and then want to add something else, it'll delete your previous response, even though it's on an anonymized basis. So please take your time to submit a full response. Thank you. Hi Dennis, I see it says that something went wrong. If you could just try it again, please. It seems as though responses are coming through, so it might just be a one-off. If it's not, and you don't mind putting a non-anonymized response in, then please just put your response in the chat function. Thank you.
Stuart, if I'm stuck on chat, how do I get to conversation?
If you've got the conversation dialog box open, then you just need to scroll up to see it, I think.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Okay, so what we'll do, and you can keep going on these questions, so I'm also then going to ask the opposite question. So you've been thinking about what we should leave behind, but the other piece is, what are the things that we should embrace? What is the lessons that we should be learning as society from the experience that we've had, and therefore what should we try and take forward as the utmost priority? And you'll see Stuart's introduced a new question there, and you fill in your response, remembering that you get one chance at it, or you have to retype the whole thing. It's good, a couple of flexibility answers coming up there. We had a lot more things to leave behind than we've got to add to, so let's try and get a few. Oh, there's a few more coming now.
I see also that some of you have taken the step of liking other people's comments. So yeah, if you do see other people's comments that you agree with, by all means, it would be great if you could throw a thumbs up and we can see like a bit of kind of collective rating in action.
Excellent. Right, so what I'm going to do then is just move on okay. So having thought, and obviously you can be typing while I'm speaking, so thanks very much for those responses. And what we'll go on now to think about is maybe our individual behaviour. So we're talking there a bit about societal behaviour, but obviously this last few months changes individual behaviour as well. So at one level, there's a lot of blame gaming starting, and some of that's playing out at an international level, particularly between the US and China at the moment, but there's other international tensions that are building as well. And we've seen in our own political system, both in the UK and in Scotland, some of those finger-pointing activities going on. But at the same time, there's also been a collective will to show an appreciation of worth, and that we maybe are having a different perspective on some of the low-wage economy activities, which have previously not had a sharp focus. And that idea of partnership working and the reliance of all of us on each other. And there's also been some interesting dynamics in terms of some of the tech-savvy countries rising to the fore. Places like Iceland and the Faroes have done very well. The Baltic states have done incredibly well in this crisis. And there have been places that have perhaps shown leadership for moral purposes rather than economic purposes, because they were able to anticipate and respond more easily to the activities that were happening in New Zealand, South Korea and Singapore, as well as the Baltic states, stand out in that respect. So all of these different kind of dynamics are happening to the relationships that we have with each other and with the governments and the societies in which we live. And it started me thinking, well, what would a resilient community look like? So if we think about where we are at the moment within Orkney, we have been blessed, if you like, with a set of circumstances that have led to us having a relatively low infection rate. Obviously, there have been some tragic incidents despite that, but it's maybe worthwhile thinking about how do we start healthy? What is it within our community that helps us be resilient to this kind of challenge? And we're at the stage at the moment where it's the start healthy bit. What is it that's creating the environment that we live in now? But we're transitioning through the relaxation of lockdown to how do we stay healthy? And that poses new challenges that we hear about every day at the moment. So for a community like Orkney, how does that change as we start opening up our ferries and our planes to people coming from other areas, or indeed will that happen? And so we need to think about how we got ourselves into this state in the first place, but also how we're going to get ourselves out of this state. Now, if we think about all of those health issues that we're dealing with at the moment, and then think, okay, well, can we apply that to energy? Then my proposition is that we should be thinking about how we increase our resilience to the energy challenges that come upon us at the moment to decarbonize, and how do we stay resilient as we go down that decarbonisation route. And you know, the situations are not exactly analogous, but I think there's many things where we can learn from our health experience and apply them to our energy experience, and think about that bipolar relationship, if you like, between what we can cope with at the moment and then how we're going to cope with the future. And then that cascades down to us maybe reflecting about how do these pressures change our own attitudes to things? Do they make us think about the balance between life and work differently? Does it make us think differently about material goods versus friends and family? Does it make us see strangers differently? How does it affect our willingness to work in particular ways, or the way that we purchase items? Are there things such as, for example, vehicle speeds, that is now the right time to, for example, introduce a 20-mile-per-hour limit in all of our urban areas instead of the 30 miles per hour? That would have a huge impact, positive impact on road traffic accidents. Something that's dear to my heart personally is the acceptance of video conferencing. Instead of having to go off around the world to see and meet people, it's going to be much more acceptable to video conference people. And this OREF meeting is a classic example of using that technology. So we've got a number of personal behaviours that have also changed in response to the situation that we find ourselves in. And so what I was thinking would be interesting is to think, instead of at a societal level, think now at a behavioural level for you. What is it that you have adopted? Have you taken on more of something, or are you prepared to do more of something than you were before? And there should be a question popping up as I speak, hopefully, in the poly situation. So this will be question 3. And this is asking a question: what are you doing more of? How has your behaviour changed because of what we're living through at the moment? So,
yeah, just to reiterate as well that it appears as though there's a small limitation in Poly for external guests to the webinar. On that basis, please, if you're comfortable, just write your response in the chat function on Teams and we can pick it up that way. For those of you that can interact with Poly, then by all means, please just respond that way. Thank you.
And as we're going through this, if you're wondering why are we doing all this interactivity, one of the things that OREF is doing at the moment is working with the council to think about what our sustainable energy strategy might be in the future. And the answers that we get out of us this evening could be part of that scene setting for that activity, because it gives us an insight into what people are thinking about and what they're prepared to do in relation to energy, which would be very difficult for us to get in any other way. So it has a real purpose. So we really appreciate your engagement in this. So it won't surprise you to learn that, as well as asking a question about what new behaviours have you adopted, what are you doing more of, the corollary of that, so question 4, is what are you doing less of, and what do you want to stop from a personal point of view? And that will pop up as question 4. This is excellent. Great engagement and productivity. I'm looking at hundreds of responses there. It's fantastic. Thank you. So what's even more miraculous is that we were due to finish this question at 8:10 to have a 5-minute comfort break for everybody to relax. And I think we've got there a couple of minutes early. So what I'd like to suggest is that we just, you can carry on answering the questions, but if you feel you'd like to go away, maybe have a coffee, tea, get a biscuit or whatever, if you go and do that, and we'll kick off again at 8:15 and have a think about islands and how islands are specifically affected by some of the issues that we've raised, and how they might have pros and cons in that regard. So if you take a break or have a chat if you want, probably a written chat or whatever, but we'll come back at 8:15 and kick off the next part of the presentation. Thank you. Okay, folks, welcome back. And we'll just wait a few seconds and then we'll kick off the second half. Could somebody just tell me if you can hear me, please?
Yep, hearing you.
Yes, fine, Gareth.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll kick off then the second half. So we're going to look at island attributes first of all, and then look at more detail at our energy systems. So what is it about islands that makes them different? So in Scotland, we've recognised that islands are different, not least because of the efforts of Orkney, Shetland and the Western Isles.
Gareth,
Yes?
sorry to interrupt you. Could you just share your screen again? We're not seeing your slides.
Ah, right, sorry. Okay, is that coming up now? Island attributes, it should say.
Yep, seeing it.
Perfect.
Right. Okay, so islands. We know that islands are different, and that not least is because of the work that Orkney, Shetland and the Western Isles did in the middle part of the last decade with the Our Islands, Our Future, as a response to the opportunity that the referendum on independence gave us. And out of that came the Islands Bill. And what that recognised is that within islands we have a whole set of geographical, cultural, economic, logistics, political differences that need to be taken account by more national systems, but they also need to be taken account by ourselves when we're thinking about our future, because we need to make a future that's appropriate for us and not for other locations. So if we think about the health pandemic, and there are certain features of, for example, Orkney that mean that we've had a different experience to other places. Some of that's related to our reduced population and the less dense methods of living, the fact that we don't have to get crowded onto urban transport networks. I think, as all of us would probably attest, that we had socially distanced and basically a lot of businesses and activities were closed down in advance of the government instructions to do so, because we understood as a community how important it was to do that. And therefore we had this collectivism. We understood that by helping each other, we were helping ourselves, and that it was our duty, if you like, as our part of our community to be part of that movement. And I think if you look at the level of adherence to the rules that's taken place in places like Orkney, it's very high. And again, that's part of that nature of island life. And in a medical sense, the fact that we have quite a dispersed medical system, because we have the different islands, each with their own surgeries. And then we have a hospital system where we have certain health care that can be provided in Kirkwall at the Balfour, and then we have these unique air bridges to Aberdeen where we've got the ICU beds for more serious treatment. So that health situation is unique to islands, and it creates both opportunities and challenges for us. And if we look then at our energy situation, again, the nature of energy in the islands is distinctive and different. We have rich energy resources on our doorstep. We have quite high levels of energy use in our businesses and our houses because of the conditions that we live in and the types of houses that we live in. We have additional energy needs, especially for transport, for ferries and aeroplanes, and that means that we have some of the highest per capita energy use in the country. And with that, in the old days, we had the highest CO2 outputs per capita in the country as well. We've also been remote from the old energy systems. When we were reliant on coal and oil or nuclear or hydro, and even the mainland Scotland wind, these are all remote from Orkney. So if we're pulling energy down the cable from the mainland, it's got to come a long way. And that's why our local energy generation is so important to us. And we're now in this enviable position where we have most of our electricity or all of our electricity over the year coming from renewables, local renewables. But as we'll come on to, we've got a bigger job to do to think about our wider energy system. So as our health system is unique and different in an island context, so our energy system is unique and different in an energy context. And that gives us, as I say, pros and cons in terms of thinking about how is our reality going to be in the future? What is our new normal going to look like? And how does the new normal that Westminster or Holyrood creates for the UK or Scotland, how is that going to get translated so that it's appropriate for island situations? And so here I've just started to outline some of the things that may help us respond to COVID and the climate crisis. So things such as our identifiable jurisdictional boundaries, strong community identity, our adaptability and capacity for change within our community, and also some of the things that might hinder us. So the level of resources that we have to apply to things, the fact that individual people, because we have a relatively small population, might get stretched across a number of roles. We're quite vulnerable to any changes in travel restrictions, and it's interesting to ponder that actually the island communities have actually been some of the most isolated communities in the UK and perhaps in many parts of the world. There is no other place where public transport access to ferries and planes have been restricted to the degree that it has in the islands. So thinking about those pros and cons, what I'd like us to do is to think about what is it that helps islands like Orkney if we think about how we're going to combat climate change in the future. What are the unique selling points? What are the advantages that we have if we're going to not just react to the imperatives of climate change, but really own this and take it forward? How could we be so progressive that we can become leaders for other people to follow? So what are the advantages that we've got in that regard? And hopefully Stuart, my glamorous assistant, will have pulled up question 5. And if you can fill that in as you've done so well for the other ones, we'll get some good feedback from you. So what is it? What are the advantages that we have as islands regards combating climate change? We've got some very fast typers there. Well done. So you've got the pattern now. So what I was wanting to also think about is if those are the advantages, then it's not all, we're not in a utopia, so it's not all perfect. So we actually have some things that mean that it's more difficult for us as islands to be able to combat climate change. So I wonder if you could also think about what are the things that disadvantage us or maybe a problem for a place like Orkney in that regard. And that's question 6. Okay. So we're hopefully beginning to build to somewhat of a crescendo now. So having thought about the pros and cons that we have as islands in regard to our energy system, what I want to do now is think about what that future energy system might look like. First of all, at an overall level, and then get down to a household level and think about our own individual energy systems. And it will not surprise any of you to learn that in terms of when we're thinking about future energy systems, my mind turns to reflex, because this project, which a number of us are engaged in Orkney, and it's been born out of that experience that we've had in Orkney over the last 20 years. And it's given us, and it gives us the opportunity to really shape the energy system for our future. And the reason that we've wanted to promote this and to create the opportunity for this is that we just felt that in so many ways the existing offering was just failing us. So if you look at the areas here in the middle, customer trust, cost and affordability, the type of investors, the system efficiency, the sources of energy, the customer service, the product and service offering, competition and profitability. There's kind of there's a good future and a not so good past. And what we want to do is basically shed the bits that are not working for us at the moment and create something in the future which works much better for a community like Orkney. And OREF and all of us as energy customers are a part of shaping this. It's not a black box that we're taking from anybody else. We're having the opportunity, and we've got the opportunity to shape this as we see best. And you know, again, tonight is an opportunity to help make that happen. So here you can see, yeah, what we're trying to leave behind in a reflex context and what we're trying to offer for a better future. And one of the things that we're thinking about there is, what is the nature of an integrated energy system? What does that include? And this diagram, which I'm not going to go through every bit of it, but it's there to really show that an energy system is much more than just electricity, or much more than just the fuel that we put into our vehicles and our heating systems. Because around that technology, we've got facilitators, we've got initiators, we've got outcomes, and we've got enablers. And those words are descriptions for people, for activities, for mechanisms, for money, for technology, all of these things that help support the whole energy system. And so within any initiative which is looking to reshape our energy system, we have to think about not only each of these as individual bits, but we have to think of all the bits and pieces that link them together. And in the context of Orkney, our energy system is very transparent to us. So if you think of all of the people, all of the businesses and enterprises that are engaged in energy linked services, here's a list of some of the ones that we've thought of. So under electricity, transport and heat, each of these types of businesses are involved in one way or another in our energy system. And so if we're going to transform our energy system to decarbonize it over the next few years, what we have to do is not only have the idea, but we have to be able to help transition all of these areas of responsibility within the energy system, as well as the sources of energy itself. And that is a particularly challenging endeavor. But again, in the context of what we've just seen we're being asked to do as a society, suddenly this has maybe become a bit more foreseeable and a bit more tangible. So what we're looking to do in Reflex is to work with existing businesses and to see how we can help work with them in this transition. So it's not a question of pushing people aside, it's a question of looking at how people can make a new contribution to a new kind of energy system that is required to provide a decarbonised future. Another part of energy is that energy links to so many other parts of our life. So here we've got a list of the elements of our wider lives that are intimately involved with energy. So an example of that is digital connectivity. For digital machines to work, we need electricity to power them. for energy systems to work, we need data to help us understand what's happening and to control them. So you can see exactly there how the digital economy and technology is interdependent with energy. When it comes to health and social issues, having warm homes and dry homes and having communications and entertainment are all parts of healthy and well-being, along with food and entertainment and learning, security. All of these things are linked to energy as well as the service they provide to us. So what we see is that if we're going to transform our energy service, we maybe need to think about how that transition also integrates with all of these other parts in our lives. So that raises the question, if we're thinking about how our lives might get transformed from the energy system that we're starting to envisage, what is it that we would want from that energy system to help make our lives better or more sustainable? So here we've got question 7. In terms of the energy system of the future, what is it that you would want that energy system to deliver for you at an overall level? Now, because of the way I've asked this question, there's not a kind of a negative one to go with it. So there's just one question here. So I'm just going to give that a bit of time. So what is it that you would want from an energy system of the future? And as Stuart's pointed out, you can have a look at what other people have written and tag them with thumbs up, maybe thumbs down even. I don't know if you can do thumbs down. You can do a sad face if you don't agree with it.
Yeah, there's a lot of good responses to this question. Certainly themes that are coming out are the ability of affordability, as well as reliability, also publicly owned and green are other themes that are coming out here. So yeah, lots of good responses here. So yeah, please keep them coming.
So if that is our thoughts about the overall energy system, what I want to do now is kind of drill down and see what that might mean at a household level and a business level. And one of our start points here is thinking about what makes up our energy system. So another way of looking at that is what kinds of energy we use. And this is called a Sankey diagram, and it outlines on the left-hand side some of the purposes that we use energy for. So domestic, household energy at the top there in green, going down through a number of industrial and administrative functions and transport to agriculture, etc. at the bottom. And you can see the actual specific purpose that they're put to on the right-hand side there. So what's used for buildings, what's used for transport. And what you can see within the ORKNEY energy mix is if you look down the right-hand side there, that yellow block is all for the buildings, and the pink at the bottom for residential residual fuel use, that is some of that's transport, but these purples in the middle are all around transport. So you can see that agriculture and transport account for a huge amount of our energy system in Orkney, whereas buildings and utilities are probably about a third of that. And in the middle here, near the top, you can see some pink colours in the middle, which are around electricity. And electricity in Orkney is actually only about 15% of our total energy use. And so we, and I am incredibly proud of the fact that we've managed to decarbonise electricity. We've got the wind turbines and the tidal machines and the solar machines, solar panels, providing us with energy, and the heat pumps. But that's only 15% of the job. So we have 85% of the work still to do, which is then to decarbonise our transport system. And if we think about Reflex and think about our lives, we have to start to think about how we're going to deal with that transport issue. And there's some really exciting things happening there. There are projects already looking at hydrogen for ferries. There's projects looking at electrical boats. There's projects looking at electrical aircraft and projects looking at hydrogen in aircraft. So we're absolutely at the front edge of this transport revolution that's going to come down the track to us. So we need to think, when we're thinking about our energy use, not just what we use in our houses and our offices, but what we use for transport, both on the island and off the island as well. So if we think about how our household energy demand may change after COVID, I'm sure many of us have been working more from home, and that will mean that we change the pattern of energy use in our homes. So that daytime trough, which was characteristic of the way we use energy, may be flattened out. There may be an unfortunate recession associated with issues in the tourism sector and the entertainment sector in particular. And that may mean that there's less money, less capital, and greater pressure on the cost of living. There may be also, because of that recessive pressure, greater wealth differentiation and a need for affordability across an even greater proportion of the population. Travel and transport is likely to reduce. We might get much greater levels of deliveries and e-commerce, but these are not energy free. They do come at a price. And indeed, digital communications and storage of data comes at an energy price as well. It's not energy free. And another factor is just a much greater level of at-home entertaining, which again doesn't mean it's energy free. It just transforms the way in which we use and the type of energy we use. So we can see that our households are likely to need energy in a different way going forward. And the same is true with business. Many businesses may need less facilities and less buildings because people are moving and working at home more. There may be, in other circumstances, a need for greater space because we have to have long-term social distancing. There may be less capacity for certain activities as well. We have a lot more delivery activity, more e-commerce activity, which will change our energy needs, our storage capacity needs, etc. So that demand for energy is likely to change in a business context as well as in a household context. So one of the things that we're trying to think about in Reflex is how do our household customers and how do our business customers get value from energy services? So energy provides value, we believe, in many different ways. So one of those is monetary value, and you can see at the top there's a bunch of activities which are related to monetary value around price and cost and revenue potential. But there's also technical value around reliability, availability, and capacity. And then there are softer issues, and you can already see that in some of the responses we've seen earlier, where ownership and sense of community and local security and aesthetics are also important to people and put a value on it. And underpinning all of that is the sustainability of our energy system. So we believe that in the Reflex energy system of the future, we need to think yes, about monetary affordability, but we need to think about these other aspects as well, which give value to us as customers. And if we think about how that might play out in a household or a business context, if you think of a well-insulated, well-energy provisioned house, it's going to have a higher intrinsic value than it would have if it was a leaky, drafty house, in all likelihood. The type of appliances that you have in a house and their efficiency and effectiveness will confer value. The type of mobility that you have, whether you have your own car, whether you have 2 cars, maybe even 3 cars in some households at the moment, what does that look like in the future? Are you going to be able to be part of a car club, or are you going to need that individual mobility going forward? Would you be willing to share that mobility solution with other people? And are there times when you could leave the car wherever it is and take a bicycle, maybe even an e-bicycle, to do a short or leisure journey? In terms of heating, what kinds of heating are going to be needed? What's the balance between heating and insulation? Recreation and leisure can take a remarkable amount of energy depending on what that activity is. And where we get our goods and services from also has an energy issue. If we're bringing in goods from south, then there's a higher energy demand than there might be if we could be producing those goods and services locally. Our gardens use energy as well as our houses. And then there's wider system support, because none of our houses act in isolation. How far we are away from the main grid system will affect any losses that there are in the system. And we also need customer support. So those are some of the practical areas where we need to think about the business value of energy. Sorry, the value of energy. And for all of those areas in the household, we've got similar areas in businesses as well. Now, I said earlier on that one of our greatest challenges is around transport, because only 15% of our energy is used for electricity, and the other 85% is used for transport and heating. And I just wanted to kind of help us think about what our personal transportation needs might be and the access that we need to transport services. So it's not just about what we drive, but it's about who drives on our behalf as well. And this graphic, I think, shows very well the full range of mobility solutions that we might need to be considering over future years. So at the moment, electric vehicles are often thought of as that middle band of cars, but we'll hopefully have more and more electrical public transport, and there's a wide range of individual mobility solutions which are likely to become more popular. The number of e-bikes is increasing rapidly over this COVID period as more people have got involved in biking, and there's a whole range of scooters and other vehicles that can also come into play there as well. So one of our major challenges, I think, as citizens is to think of energy not just in terms of electricity to our houses, but think about how we're going to alter our transport solutions as well. So what I'd like us to do is thinking back to those elements of our houses that we looked at before: appliances, heating, the fabric of houses, thinking about how you use energy outside the house, and thinking about transport. Then considering what are your key energy system needs in relation to your own situation. So if you could wave a magic wand in relation to your own energy life, what is it that you would like to be able to lease, buy, purchase, rent, get help with? Any of those things that would help you in your own personal energy system. So that's question 8, which is our last question for the night. So what are the things that would help improve your own personal energy system needs?
Yeah,
Okay.
looking at some of these responses, Gareth, they're principally focused on EVs and affordable options in that kind of space. So that's good feedback.
Great stuff. So absolutely keep going on those, and I'm just going to kind of wrap up with some concluding remarks now, really. So what I hope we've looked at today is the links between this health pandemic, this crisis that we've been living through in unprecedented times, and how that might link to climate change and energy. And I think we've seen that there is a signal in that climate change graph, if you like, that is associated with the pandemic. But perhaps what's surprising is that for all of that change in our lives that's taken place in the last 2 or 3 months, that level of effect that's happened to date is quite small. It was, around 10% of annual emissions, and a very small change in the actual concentration of CO2. And so on the optimistic side, that tells me that we can make a change. We can, as a population, live radically differently and adapt to a crisis and react to a crisis in a way which means we're being responsible because we're thinking about how we need to change things. But on the other side, I'm kind of also aware that what this is suggesting to me is that the scale of change that we're going to have to go through to actually decarbonize our lives and decarbonize our energy system are going to be considerable. And it's going to involve a transition which needs to be managed carefully so it's as less disruptive as possible. But it is going to involve wholehearted change in the way we see our relationship with energy. And this pandemic, although it's the first that we've experienced in this part of the world, there have been previous pandemics in the last decades in other parts of the world. And it would be perhaps naive for us to believe that these health issues and challenges are not going to come back at us. And certainly the WHO is seeing that energy and climate and health are linked in so many different ways. And if you think back to that malnutrition, 35 million people a year dying because of malnutrition issues, and that again will be affected by climate change. So if we think about the real risks that the whole world faces, for sure this pandemic has given us a shock that we've had to react to, but it's really nothing compared to the shock that the climate change imperative needs to give us and the level of change that we need to get from that. And so one of the questions in my mind is about how do we affect that change? So does it come through regulations? And if you think of recent events, things like seatbelt wearing, things like the smoking ban, things like stopping alcohol at sporting events and plastic bag use, these have all been regulated changes in the way we affect our lives. Relatively small, but nevertheless, they're things that have changed. But there's also been things that have changed because of public opinion. And I've picked out some here around David Attenborough and the plastics case, the Me Too movement, Farage and Johnson and the whole Brexit situation, Greta Thunberg and what she was doing so effectively in the autumn last year around the climate emergency, and just in the last few days, poor George Floyd, who unfortunately died in America, but has highlighted that issue around race and the inequalities there. So we have a choice. We can regulate or we can change through public opinion. We need both of these things probably to be effective. Certainly the level of regulation that's been introduced in the last few months, I think, has blown a coach and horses through some of the mantras that, oh, we can't do that because it's too difficult. I think what we've shown in the last 2 months or 3 months is that there's virtually nothing that's too difficult if you have the imperative and the desire to make things happen. So we need to think about that as citizens. We need to think about how we mobilize our opinion and make that heard, and how we encourage the people that are there to serve us and make the decisions, and how they make the decisions that are right for us and our future. And in terms of thinking about that locally, what happens in the future can affect ORKNEY in 2 different ways. And we can wait and see how that happens and react to it, or we can actually influence it and have a positive influence on those futures that might be awaiting us. And those are relevant to health, they're relevant to energy, and they're relevant to the other sides of our lives as well. And one of the exciting things, I think, is that this crisis has come at a time where we have a very significant project that's just kicking off, which is designed to create an energy system for our futures. It's an energy system that's meant to be responsive to our needs. It accepts that the status quo is not an option, so it's not anything that's wedded in the past. It's about creating a new future, an energy system for the future. And it's about being responsive, and it's about being flexible. We've already acknowledged that it needs to address technical, social, economic, and environmental issues. And this fusion of climate change and COVID and the co-occurrence of those two crises at the same time, I think really shows how we work in an integrated world. And if we can solve one problem, then we can help solve other problems as well. And so thinking about what that means in practical terms, some of you will have seen this slide before. As Orkney, we have to decide if we're going to go down that decarbonisation journey. And if we do go down that journey, when are we going to get to that point where we've decarbonised our lives, our economy, our system? And at the moment, the UK has said it's going to get to net zero at 2050. Scotland has said it's going to get there in 2045. The question is, when does Orkney need to get there? If we're going to be leaders and at the front end of this journey, we have to be an example that other people can follow. And it seems to me that the latest date that we could achieve that would be 2030, and we probably need to try and get there a significant way down the line by about 2027. So that's 7 short years from now, but it's on the back of 20 long years where we've had the best possible preparation for this. And I think that, like everybody else, I sit there some days, maybe last year and the year before, thinking, is this really going to happen? But what the last months has told us is that anything can happen if we want to make it do that. And I think it's up to our collective to see where we want to go to make it. So hopefully, Orkney can be decarbonized by around 2020.
Gareth, I'll come in. Francis, can you mute your microphone, please? Thank you. Gareth, thank you very much indeed for that. It seems one of the big gaps we've got with Teams is the inability to put effective applause at the end of something like this. So I think that's something we definitely need to work on. I'm also conscious that you've covered a huge amount of ground, and remarkably, truly remarkably, you've stuck to time, which is, I think, is some sort of first.
Exactly.
So I think I'm not sure what the intention is in terms of being able to carry the discussion on these points, Gareth. Have you got any particular thoughts about what we should do on that?
I would bow to Stuart's technical knowledge. And obviously, if people want to post questions, probably on the chat is the easiest thing. Or if people have got a burning question or point they want to raise, then I think you can raise a hand, and maybe Stuart or yourself could act as chair and just guide us through for the 5 minutes we've got left.
Yeah, absolutely. If we could try it via the raise hand function, or if there's a particular question that they want to put in the chat function, then either we can kind of field them that way. So feel free. We've got 5 minutes left, so do your worst. Or you can just bask in the positive feedback, Gareth.
Maybe quit while you're ahead, Gareth. That's what I think. Maybe.
Great. Well, people know where I am, and if anybody's got any follow-up questions, send an email or give us a call. Yeah.
Sorry, there does seem to be one hand raised, which is from Craig Mitchell. He's currently on mute, so I'll unmute him so he can ask his question. Or no, he's already unmuted himself. So go for it, Craig.
Thanks very much for that, Gareth. It was really good. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Perfect. I just wondered about Orkney's current housing stock. So some of the houses that are going up are unique in their high spec qualities when it comes to the insulation and things like that. And I just wondered about the Orkney's housing stock and retrofitting and how this is being addressed, because quite a lot of the EPC ratings are quite low on some of the older generation houses, which is I just wondered what's being done about that aspect of the energy system.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Basically, within Reflex, the core part of Reflex is to look at energy management technologies within the home rather than the actual fabric of the home itself. But as a project, we realized early on that we had to be able to address household fabric if we were going to be able to provide the right solutions for many houses. So basically, the idea of energy mortgages for houses is something that we're considering, where the funds that we're raising, as well as being able to be used to help buy EVs and heating systems and battery systems, could also be used to help provide improvements to the fabric of houses as well. So there was a project or an initiative called the Green Deal that the government tried to launch a number of years ago, and it didn't really take off at that time. But we feel that it's necessary to have something like that. And it involves us as householders maybe thinking a bit differently about houses, so that the value of your house is also reflecting the energy efficiency of it, as well as all the other attributes of it as well. So it's definitely something that's on the agenda for Reflex.
I see as well that Luke Fraser, who knows things all EPC related, has offered to input into that question too, Luke, so feel free to unmute and put in your 2 cents as well.
Thanks, Stuart. I'm team leader at the council, run our energy efficiency programs. The council, we've got access to the energy performance certificate database. We've got about 5,500 properties in Orkney have got an active energy performance certificate, so we've got access to all that data. We also we've got projects targeting energy efficiency, be it new insulation, new heating systems, so that will be coming online as soon as the restrictions are lifted with COVID. Working very closely with Gareth and the guys, also part of Reflex as well. So we're trying to tie our programs very much in alongside Reflex. So there's lots happening at the minute. We are trying to enhance the offering to households to improve their energy efficiency and improve insulation. It just comes down to eligibility of the funding that we get from the Scottish Government and others. We just have to make sure that funding is spent within their rules, but no, we're certainly doing as much as we possibly can to enhance the energy efficiency of Orkney's housing stock and get those EPCs up.
Great stuff, Luke. And just I just saw a comment there from Evelyn about what are we going to do with all of this feedback. So first of all, I'll say thank you once again for all your feedback and your engagement. The idea is that we will collate this, not necessarily in a word-for-word report, but we're going to take the sentiments that you've offered in these different questions and use those as part of the evidence base that we've got to help inform the action plan that we're developing on for the sustainable energy strategy. And previous OREF meetings that some of you will have been at have similarly gathered thoughts from the participants in other questions. So this will add to that body of evidence, and not necessarily as a final outcome, but it will help give us the agenda setting points that we need to address in future conversations. So it will definitely have a life beyond this meeting tonight.
Okay, so I'm conscious we have just hit 9 o'clock, so I'm going to suggest that we wrap this meeting up by thanking Gareth very much for the presentation. Thanks very much indeed for Stuart and Jen for making everything work in the background. The use of the polls this time was a new departure. I think it's been extremely successful. So well done for the technical jiggery pokery in the background. Our thanks to you, everybody who contributed. I think I counted 49 people were on the call at one point. I think it would be in the OREF meeting we held a little earlier today, we were talking about how we bring forward the idea of resurrecting the Sustainable Orkney Conference that we were trying to do, but got the lid slammed on it just for COVID. And we are intending to do something which will involve something online. We're going to work this up because I think it's been very successful tonight, and we want to build on this more. If you do have ideas, please do either put them in the chat function, or alternatively do let Francis know through the email address of office@oref.co.uk. So my thanks to everybody. I would say safe travel home, but probably don't need to say that, so we'll let that bit go. Okay, good night everybody. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.